Royal Guard played violin to honor his fallen comrades, and his audition left the judges emotion. To the ordinary eye, he looked like any other man in a military uniform, upright posture, polished boots, and a calm, disciplined expression. But behind those steady eyes and stern face lay a soul shaped by loyalty, duty, and deep emotion. James had served as a royal guard for nearly a decade, standing at the gates of Buckingham Palace, protecting the crown, and following every order with unwavering discipline. Every morning he rose before the sun, his life dictated by strict routines, drills, and ceremonies. Yet there was one part of his life that remained hidden from the world, a part that allowed him to breathe, feel, and connect with the deepest corners of his heart, his violin. The violin was a gift from his mother, a gentle woman with soft hands and a warm smile. She had taught him to play when he was just a boy, sitting in the small living room of their modest house. She would hum along as he drew the bow across the strings, correcting his fingers when they faltered and celebrating every note he played well. Music, she told him, was more than just sound. It was a way to speak when words could not. When she passed away suddenly from an illness, James had been devastated. He was only 16. In her absence, the violin became more than an instrument. It became a connection to the woman who had shaped his childhood, a reminder of love, care, and warmth in a world that sometimes felt harsh and unforgiving. As James grew older, he joined the Royal Guards. The training was rigorous. He endured long hours of physical exercise, mastered complex drills, and learned to respond instantly to threats. His days were filled with precision, discipline, and a sense of pride that came from serving his country. But the battlefield was not always visible. The danger for James would later come in ways he never expected, not in the polished halls of Buckingham Palace, but in the faraway deserts and mountains where his unit was deployed on missions. James's unit was known for its bravery. The men he served with were not just colleagues, they were brothers. They ate together, trained together, and faced dangers side by side. There was a silent understanding among them, a bond that could not be broken by fear or hardship. They knew each other's strengths and weaknesses and could predict each other's actions in the most dangerous situations. James had always felt proud to be part of such a team, and he trusted his comrades with his life, just as they trusted him with theirs. But life has a way of testing even the strongest bonds. On a cold winter morning, James and his team were sent on a mission that was supposed to be routine. The operation involved securing a remote area and ensuring no hostile forces could enter. It was meant to be straightforward, almost mundane, and yet it turned into a nightmare that James would never forget. The attack came suddenly. Shadows moved too fast, and explosions shook the ground beneath them. James tried to remain calm, following the training drilled into him for years, but nothing could have prepared him for the sight of his closest friends falling around him. The air was thick with smoke and dust, and the sounds of gunfire were deafening. He could hear the screams, the shouts, the desperate calls of men he had eaten with the night before, laughed with during quiet moments, and trusted with his life. The scene burned into his memory, a permanent scar on his mind. When the chaos ended, James was left standing among the ruins, shaken and exhausted. He counted the men he had lost, his heart sinking with each number. Each friend, each brother in arms was gone. The grief was overwhelming, a wave that threatened to pull him under. He felt hollow, as though a part of himself had been ripped away. For days afterward, he moved through life in a fog, unable to find comfort in anything. The world seemed muted, colors duller, sounds distant. Even the duties he had once taken pride in felt meaningless. It was during this period of deep sorrow that James returned to the one thing that had always brought him solace, the violin. He found it in his small quarters, the wood polished and strings still tight. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to hold it. He drew the bow across the strings, and the sound that came out was raw, filled with pain, longing, and love. It was imperfect, but it was honest. Music became his refuge, the only way he could express the sorrow that words could not carry. Each evening, after the duties of the day were done, James would sit alone, the violin resting against his shoulder. He would close his eyes and let the music flow, imagining his fallen comrades beside him. Every note was a tribute, a story of courage, of laughter shared, of the camaraderie that had been stolen from him too soon. Sometimes he would play for hours, losing himself in the melodies, feeling a sense of connection that the real world could no longer provide. The other guards noticed the change in him. James was quieter, more introspective. He no longer smiled as freely, nor did he engage in the usual banter that had once filled the barracks. But there was also a sense of peace about him, a quiet strength that radiated through his presence. Some guessed that he had suffered a loss, others simply respected his need for solitude. No one could have guessed that the stoic guard they saw each day carried such a deep and personal grief, expressed only through the music of a violin. As the weeks passed, James began to compose small pieces in memory of his comrades. Each composition told a story, the brave actions of one friend, the humor of another, the quiet strength of the men who had stood beside him. He wrote down the music, carefully noting every detail, creating a private collection that no one else would see. It was a sacred ritual, a way to keep their memory alive, a promise that they would not be forgotten. Music also became a source of healing. James began to sleep better, to eat more, to find small moments of joy again. The pain never fully disappeared, but it became manageable, a companion rather than a prison. He realized that through music, he could honor his fallen friends in a way that nothing else allowed. The violin gave him a voice when grief had left him speechless. One evening, after another long day of duties, James was walking through the quiet palace grounds. The winter air was crisp, and the snow had just begun to fall. He paused, looking at the flag fluttering in the distance, thinking of the friends he had lost, and made a silent vow. He would carry their memory with him, not just in his heart, but in his actions, in his music, and in the way he lived his life. The violin was no longer just a hobby or a connection to his mother. It was a way to honor those who had given everything for their duty. Even in the regimented life of a royal guard, James found moments to let the music flow. During quiet hours when the palace corridors were empty, he would play softly, filling the halls with haunting melodies that spoke of loss, loyalty, and hope. Sometimes he imagined his comrades listening, nodding with approval, their presence felt even though they were gone. These moments became the highlight of his days, a reminder that while life could take people away, memories and love could endure. In the months that followed, James's dedication to both his duties and his music deepened. He became known among his peers not just as a disciplined and capable guard, but as someone who carried himself with a quiet dignity shaped by grief and honor. The violin had transformed him, allowing him to process pain, to connect with his emotions, and to find meaning in a life that had been shaken by loss. Though he continued to stand at the palace gates, to march in ceremonies, and to follow orders without question, James knew that his true service extended beyond physical protection. By honoring his fallen comrades through music, he kept their memory alive, turning sorrow into something beautiful. Every note he played was a tribute, every melody a story of courage, friendship, and sacrifice. And so, James Whittaker lived a life that was more than just duty. Behind the polished uniform and the disciplined exterior lay a man shaped by love, loss, and the power of music. A man who had learned that even in the darkest moments, beauty and remembrance could survive. The violin had become his voice, his refuge, and his tribute, and through it, he carried the spirits of those he had lost with him, wherever he went. After months of playing alone in his quarters and composing music in private, James Whittaker began to realize that his violin could do more than help him heal. It could also honor the memory of his fallen comrades in a way that would reach others. Each evening, as the sun set behind the palace walls, he would sit quietly with his instrument, imagining the faces of the friends he had lost. He remembered their laughter, their courage, and the moments they had shared together. These memories were painful, yet they carried a sense of purpose. He knew that keeping their memory alive was more than just a personal act. It was a duty, a way to ensure that their sacrifice was never forgotten. One afternoon, while reviewing the music he had written, James came across an announcement for a prestigious national music program. It was an opportunity for musicians from across the country to audition for a place in an elite ensemble. His first instinct was to dismiss the idea. He was a royal guard, not a professional musician. The other participants would be young, trained in conservatories, and experienced in performing in front of large audiences. Could he, a soldier with years of military duty and only private practice, really compete? Despite his doubts, something stirred inside him. This was not about competition or personal glory. This was about honor, about paying tribute to the friends he had lost. James imagined performing in front of people who would listen, truly listen, to the story he had to tell through music. He imagined the possibility that his violin could carry the memory of his comrades beyond the walls of the palace and touch hearts in ways that words never could. For the first time, the idea of performing publicly became more than just a dream. It became a calling. The next few days were filled with quiet contemplation. James thought about the piece he would play. It had to be perfect, not in the sense of flawless technique, but in the sense that it captured the emotions he carried. He wanted the judges and audience to feel the grief, the camaraderie, and the courage of his fallen friends. He wanted them to hear the story of men who had given everything, not just in battle, but in the bonds of friendship and loyalty. He decided to start preparing in earnest. Each morning, after completing his duties as a guard, he would retreat to his quarters, violin in hand, and practice for hours. He focused on every note, every pause, every nuance. The music had to speak for him, for the memories he cherished, and for the message he wanted to convey. Some evenings, he would play until his fingers ached, refusing to stop until the music sounded exactly as he envisioned it in his mind. Preparation was not easy. Balancing his responsibilities as a royal guard with the intense practice required for the audition tested his endurance. He woke before sunrise to complete physical training, spent the day standing watch or performing ceremonial duties, and then devoted the evenings to music. Sleep was often scarce and fatigue was a constant companion. Yet he pressed on. The thought of honoring his comrades gave him strength, and the music became a source of energy, not exhaustion. As the audition date approached, James began to feel a mixture of excitement and nervousness. The palace was filled with the usual routines, but for him, every day carried a sense of anticipation. He would practice in the quiet hours, listening carefully to each note, imagining the emotions he wanted to convey. Sometimes he would close his eyes and picture the faces of his friends, imagining them standing beside him, nodding in approval as he played. Other times, the memories would overwhelm him and tears would blur his vision. But he never allowed himself to stop. He knew that these emotions were the essence of the performance, the heart of the music he wanted to share. Despite his dedication, James felt a deep fear, the fear of judgment. He knew the judges would be experienced musicians, trained to notice even the smallest mistakes. What if his nerves betrayed him? What if his performance fell short? What if he could not convey the depth of his feelings through the music? These thoughts haunted him, and there were moments when he questioned whether he should even audition. But every time doubt crept in, he reminded himself of why he was doing this, not for personal recognition, but for the memory of those who had sacrificed everything. One evening, as snow lightly covered the palace grounds, James made a decision. He would perform. He would not let fear stop him, and he would not let the memory of his friends fade into silence. This decision brought a sense of calm that he had not felt in months. It was as if the weight of grief had found a purpose, and he could carry it forward in a way that mattered. With renewed determination, he began to refine his piece. He experimented with tempo and dynamics, ensuring that each part of the music conveyed the emotions he intended. Some sections were solemn and mournful, reflecting the pain of loss. Others were bold and resolute, reflecting the courage and loyalty of his comrades. He wanted the piece to be a journey, guiding the listener through the full spectrum of feelings he had experienced. James also focused on his posture, breathing, and presence. He knew that a performance was not just about music. It was about conveying emotion through every movement, every glance, every expression. He practiced in front of a mirror, imagining an audience before him, feeling the intensity of the moment. Slowly, he began to gain confidence, realizing that the music was not just about technical skill. It was about honesty, about authenticity, and about the courage to share a deeply personal story. During this period, James found support in unexpected places. A fellow guard, noticing the time he spent with his violin, expressed quiet admiration. Another offered encouragement, reminding him that courage took many forms, and that standing for what he believed in was itself an act of bravery. These small gestures reinforced his resolve. He realized that while he was performing alone, he was not truly alone. He carried the memory and spirit of his comrades with him, and that was enough to inspire him. As the day of the audition drew closer, James allowed himself to imagine the moment he would step into the hall. He envisioned the judges, the audience, and the quiet hush that would fall over the room as the first note sounded. He imagined the music filling the space, telling the story of bravery, loss, and remembrance. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating, but he knew it was his responsibility to go through with it. This was more than an audition. It was a tribute, a mission of the heart. On the night before the audition, James barely slept. He lay awake, thinking of the friends he had lost, recalling their names, their laughter, and their faces. He held his violin close, feeling the smooth wood beneath his fingers, remembering the lessons his mother had taught him years ago. In the quiet darkness, he whispered a promise. No matter what happened tomorrow, he would honor them with every note, every pause, and every melody. The morning of the audition arrived with crisp air and clear skies. James dressed carefully, his uniform immaculate, boots polished to a shine. He carried his violin with reverence, aware of the weight of the moment. Every step toward the audition hall was measured, every breath deliberate. He knew that once he began to play, he would be opening his heart in a way that few could imagine. As he approached the hall, he noticed the other participants, young, confident musicians carrying their instruments with practiced ease. Some looked at him with curiosity, a royal guard standing among them. James felt a moment of doubt, wondering if he truly belonged, but he reminded himself why he was there. This was not about competition. This was about truth, honor, and remembrance. He drew a deep breath, lifted his chin, and stepped inside. The audition hall was large and formal, with polished wooden floors and high ceilings that amplified every sound. The judges sat in a row, their faces calm and composed, pens ready to note the technical details of each performance. James's heart raced, but he steadied himself. He placed the violin under his chin, drew the bow across the strings, and let the first note ring out. The music flowed, carrying with it the full weight of his emotions. Pain, grief, courage, and loyalty intertwined in every phrase. James played as if he were speaking directly to his fallen comrades, each note a message, each melody a memory. The room was silent, save for the music, and James felt a strange sense of connection, as if the spirits of his friends were there beside him, guiding his hands and bow. Time seemed to stretch as he played, each measure a step through the story he had carried for so long. The judges, initially neutral, began to respond subtly, their brows furrowed in concentration, their expressions softening, their eyes glistening with emotion. James did not play for them. He played for those who could no longer hear his music, for the friends whose bravery and friendship had shaped his life. When the final note faded into silence, James lowered the violin and exhaled, feeling a mix of exhaustion and relief. The room remained quiet for a moment, as though the audience and judges were absorbing the weight of what they had just heard. Then slowly, the first judge raised a hand, followed by the others. The applause began, not loud or rushed, but heartfelt and sincere. It was a recognition of not just skill, but of courage, of honesty, and of a deeply moving tribute. James felt a warmth spread through him, a mixture of pride, sadness, and fulfillment. He had done what he had set out to do. He had honored his comrades, shared their story, and allowed his music to speak the words his heart could not. In that moment, he realized that the audition was more than an opportunity for recognition. It was a chance to transform grief into beauty, loss into remembrance, and duty into something deeply personal and lasting. The day of the audition had arrived, and James Whittaker could feel the weight of anticipation pressing against him. Even as he walked through the grand doors of the auditorium, the polished wooden floors reflecting the soft sunlight streaming through the tall windows, he felt a mixture of nerves and determination. Every step he took echoed through the empty hall, a quiet reminder that this was no ordinary day. This was a moment he had prepared for, not for personal glory, but for those who could no longer stand beside him. His fallen comrades, the men whose laughter and courage had once filled his days, were with him in spirit, and their presence gave him strength. The hall was filled with other musicians, each carrying their instruments with a confidence born of years of study and performance. Young pianists, violinists, and cellists moved about, tuning their instruments, practicing scales, and exchanging polite nods. To them, James must have appeared unusual, a royal guard, tall and upright in uniform, carrying his violin with a solemn air. Whispers traveled through the room as they watched him. Some were curious, some skeptical. How could a soldier, not a conservatory-trained musician, compete against seasoned performers? James noticed the glances but ignored them. He had rehearsed for months, and he knew that what he was about to do was far greater than any competition. The judges sat at the front, their expressions calm and professional as they prepared their sheets and notes. They had seen countless auditions, countless faces, and countless performances. They were experts in identifying technique, tone, and musicality. Yet none of their experience could prepare them for the story James was about to tell through his music. When his name was called, James rose slowly, carrying his violin with care. His boots clicked softly against the floor, and he could feel the eyes of the audience on him. A hush fell over the hall as he stepped onto the stage, his uniform crisp and immaculate. He placed the violin under his chin, feeling the familiar warmth of the instrument against his shoulder. This was more than a performance. This was a tribute. This was a chance to honor the memory of men who had given everything. As he drew the bow across the strings, the first note resonated through the hall. It was clear, solemn, and filled with an emotion that words could never capture. The judges straightened in their seats, their pens momentarily forgotten as they listened. The music flowed, carrying with it the weight of grief and the strength of loyalty. Each note told a story: the bravery of comrades in the face of danger, the quiet moments of camaraderie in the barracks, the laughter shared over small victories, and the deep sorrow of loss. James closed his eyes as he played, allowing the music to guide his hands. He imagined the faces of his friends, the sound of their voices, and the moments they had shared. Each movement of the bow became an expression of love and respect. He poured everything into the performance: his grief, his memories, his determination, and his hope. The music was no longer just sound. It was a living, breathing tribute, a bridge between the past and the present. As the piece continued, the judges' initial neutrality began to shift. Their faces softened, and some leaned forward, captivated by the depth of feeling conveyed. This was not merely a technical performance. It was an emotional journey. James' music spoke of courage, sacrifice, and the bonds that could never be broken, even by death. The hall seemed to hold its breath as the melody rose and fell, each phrase telling a story more powerful than words could express. Audience members, too, were drawn into the performance. Some had tears in their eyes, others sat in stunned silence, unable to believe the intensity of the emotions flowing from a single instrument. James' music bypassed conscious thought, reaching directly into the heart. It reminded them of their own losses, their own loved ones, and the fragility and beauty of life. In that moment, the violin became more than an instrument. It became a voice for the unspoken, a way to honor those who could not be honored otherwise. James carefully transitioned into the more somber sections of the piece, slow and deliberate, each note carrying the weight of sorrow. He thought of the men who had fallen beside him, the friends whose lives had ended too soon. He imagined their faces, their smiles, their courage, and their laughter. The music became a dialogue with the past, a conversation he had longed to have but could only express through sound. Then the piece shifted again, rising with bold, resolute melodies. This section reflected not just grief, but the courage and loyalty of those he had served with. It was a tribute to their bravery, a celebration of the bonds that death could not sever. Each note carried pride and respect, and James felt a surge of strength and connection. He realized that the music had become a lifeline, not only for him, but for everyone listening. It was proof that love, honor, and remembrance could endure even in the face of tragedy. As he approached the final notes, James felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The performance had been more than he had imagined. He had given everything, played from the depths of his soul, and told the story he had carried for so long. The last note lingered in the air, vibrating with emotion and resonance. The hall was silent for a moment, as though the world itself paused to honor the music. Then, slowly, the applause began. At first, it was quiet, hesitant, but it quickly grew into a heartfelt recognition of the power and emotion they had witnessed. The judges, some with tears glistening in their eyes, rose from their seats to applaud. They praised not only James' technical skill, but also the honesty, courage, and depth of feeling in his performance. One judge whispered to another, remarking that it was one of the most moving auditions they had ever witnessed. James lowered his violin, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and relief. His heart was full, and yet there was a quiet sadness in knowing that his friends were not there to see it with him. Still, he felt their presence in every note, every melody, and every applause. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of peace. He had honored them, shared their story, and allowed their memory to live on in a way that words alone could never achieve. The experience changed him. James realized that music was more than a personal solace. It was a bridge between the living and the dead, a way to carry forward stories that might otherwise be forgotten. He understood that performing was not about fame or recognition, but about connection, expression, and remembrance. Every performance could be a tribute, every note a message of love and respect. After the audition, many people approached him, expressing admiration and gratitude. Fellow musicians, audience members, and even some judges wanted to know more about the story behind the music. James shared the memories of his comrades, telling of their courage, humor, and the bond they had shared. People were moved not only by the music, but by the story, and many were inspired to reflect on their own lives, relationships, and the importance of honoring those who had shaped them. James' experience at the audition became a turning point. He realized that he could use his music to honor more than just his fallen comrades. He could inspire, comfort, and connect with others. Each performance became an act of remembrance, a way to keep memories alive, and a message that courage and loyalty were values worth cherishing. In the weeks that followed, James continued to perform privately and at small gatherings. His story spread quietly, touching hearts in ways he had never imagined. People admired not only his skill but also his courage, both as a royal guard and as a man willing to express his deepest emotions through music. His performances became a symbol of hope, resilience, and the enduring power of memory. Through it all, James never forgot the reason he had started. The music was always for his friends, the men who had stood beside him in life and remained with him in memory. Every note, every melody, every pause was a testament to their courage and friendship. The audition had been just the beginning, a moment when private grief was transformed into public tribute, and the impact of his music was felt far beyond the walls of the hall. As he practiced in the quiet evenings, James reflected on how far he had come. The violin, once a connection to his mother, had become a bridge to the past, a way to honor the fallen and a means to express emotions that could not be contained. He had discovered that courage was not only found in battle, but also in the act of sharing one's heart, in telling stories that mattered, and in creating beauty from grief. By the time the next season of performances arrived, James was ready. Each audience, each hall, each note was approached with the same dedication, focus, and love that had carried him through months of preparation. He knew that the music would never be perfect in a technical sense, but it would always be true. And in truth, he found something far greater than recognition. He found connection, purpose, and the power of honoring those who could no longer speak for themselves. After the audition, James Whittaker walked out of the hall with a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and quiet pride. The applause, the judges' recognition, and the heartfelt comments from the audience still echoed in his mind. But as he stepped into the crisp air outside, he realized that this moment was bigger than him. It was not about awards, certificates, or accolades. It was about the memory of his fallen comrades and the promise he had made to honor them through music. Every step he took, every breath he drew, carried their memory with him. The days following the audition were filled with reflection and new opportunities. Word of his performance had spread quietly but quickly. People were touched not only by his skill on the violin, but by the story behind it. Fellow guards, who had long known him as a disciplined and quiet man, began to see a different side of James, a man capable of deep emotion, courage, and vulnerability. He received messages of admiration and encouragement, not only from his colleagues, but also from strangers who had witnessed the power of his music. James knew that his journey had only just begun. The music he played was no longer for private solace alone. It had the power to inspire, to heal, and to remind people of the importance of memory and gratitude. He began to perform at small memorial events, ceremonies honoring fallen soldiers, and gatherings where people came together to remember loved ones. Each performance was approached with the same care and dedication as the audition, each note infused with the emotions he had carried for so long. The first of these events was a quiet ceremony at a local veterans center. James had been invited to play a few pieces in honor of soldiers who had given their lives in service. As he took his place, wearing his Royal Guard uniform and carrying his violin, he felt a familiar mix of nerves and determination. He began to play, and immediately the room was filled with the haunting melodies that had been his companions for months. The audience listened in silence, some closing their eyes, others holding the hands of companions, all drawn into the emotion of the music. After the performance, a group of veterans approached James. Many had tears in their eyes, and they thanked him not only for his music, but for the way it had honored their comrades. They spoke of how rare it was to find someone who could convey such emotion and respect through art. James listened quietly, humbled by their words. He realized that through the simple act of playing the violin, he had been able to touch lives, provide comfort, and keep the memory of bravery alive. Over time, James' performances became more widely known. Invitations came from other memorials, charity events, and schools. He was asked to speak briefly before some performances, sharing the story of the friends he had lost and the role music had played in helping him honor their memory. He discovered that storytelling and music together created a powerful impact, allowing audiences to connect with the emotions in a deeper, more personal way. People would often come to him afterward, sharing stories of their own losses, expressing gratitude, and sometimes even finding the courage to play or sing in tribute themselves. Despite the growing recognition, James remained humble. He never sought attention or praise. Every performance was a tribute, every note a message of love and remembrance. He continued his duties as a royal guard, blending discipline with emotion, tradition with personal expression. His colleagues began to understand that courage came in many forms, not only in facing danger, but also in standing up and expressing one's heart. James became a quiet example of how strength and vulnerability could coexist. One particular event marked a turning point in his journey. He was invited to perform at a national ceremony honoring soldiers who had fallen in recent conflicts. The hall was massive, filled with dignitaries, families of the fallen, and representatives from military units across the country. James felt the gravity of the occasion as he stepped onto the stage, violin in hand. He drew a deep breath and began to play, pouring every ounce of emotion he had into the music. As the first notes filled the hall, James noticed the reaction of the audience. Some were visibly moved, their faces reflecting sorrow, pride, and gratitude. Some were holding back tears, while others allowed themselves to be swept away by the emotion of the music. The judges from his audition, who had attended as special guests, sat quietly, deeply moved once again by the depth of feeling in his performance. It was clear that his music was transcending the boundaries of performance and becoming something larger, a shared experience of memory, honor, and humanity. After the performance, James was approached by many people. Families thanked him for honoring their loved ones. Fellow guards and soldiers expressed admiration for the way he had transformed grief into something meaningful and beautiful. He even received a letter from a high-ranking official praising not only his musical skill, but his dedication to honoring the fallen. The words were humbling, yet they reinforced the purpose that had driven him from the very beginning. James realized that the promise he had made to his comrades, to honor them through music, was now reaching far beyond what he had imagined. James continued to compose new pieces, each one dedicated to different aspects of service, friendship, and sacrifice. Some were solemn, reflecting the loss and grief of battle. Others were uplifting, celebrating courage, loyalty, and moments of joy amidst hardship. He experimented with melodies and harmonies, always keeping the emotional truth of the music at the forefront. Every time he performed, he felt a connection, not just with the audience but with those who could no longer be present. Music had become a bridge between life and memory, a way to keep stories alive, and a method to honor courage in all its forms. As the years passed, James became known not only as a disciplined royal guard, but also as a musician whose performances touched hearts across the country. He was invited to speak at schools, community centers, and military events, sharing his story and the lessons he had learned. He encouraged young people to find ways to honor those who had helped, guided, or protected them. He spoke about courage, resilience, and the importance of expressing emotions honestly, whether through music, writing, or simple acts of remembrance. Through it all, James never forgot the friends who had inspired him. Their memory remained at the center of everything he did. The violin, once a connection to his mother, had become a vessel for remembrance, a way to carry forward the lives and stories of those who had passed. James understood that while grief could never fully disappear, it could be transformed into something beautiful, meaningful, and lasting. One quiet evening, as James walked through the palace grounds, violin in hand, he paused to look at the snow-covered lawns. The flag fluttered gently in the winter breeze, and he felt a sense of peace. He lifted his instrument and began to play softly, letting the music flow freely. He imagined his comrades listening, smiling, and nodding in approval. The notes carried through the still air, a quiet tribute that only he and the spirits of his friends could hear. It was a moment of connection, a reminder that life, love, and memory were intertwined in ways that could never be taken away. James' story eventually reached people far beyond the military and music communities. Articles were written about him, sharing how a royal guard had turned personal grief into a national tribute through the violin. Videos of his performances circulated, moving viewers around the world. People were inspired by the courage it took to stand before an audience, to be vulnerable, and to express deep emotion openly. Many wrote to him, sharing their own stories of loss, bravery, and remembrance, and thanking him for inspiring them to honor their own loved ones. Despite the growing attention, James remained grounded. He continued his life as a royal guard, performing his duties with the same discipline and focus he had always shown. But the music had changed him, allowing him to connect with people in ways he had never imagined. He had discovered that courage was not only found on the battlefield, but also in the act of sharing one's heart, telling stories that mattered, and creating beauty from grief. In time, James realized that the impact of his music went far beyond individual performances. It had become a legacy, a living tribute to courage, friendship, and the enduring power of memory. People who had never known his fallen comrades were touched by their story. People who had never played an instrument were inspired to explore ways to express their own feelings and honor their loved ones. James had turned his grief into something that could inspire, comfort, and connect people across generations. As he prepared for another performance at a national memorial, James reflected on his journey. From the quiet barracks where he practiced alone, to the moment he stepped onto the stage for his first audition, to the countless performances that followed, every step had been driven by love, remembrance, and the promise he had made. He understood that the violin had given him a voice for the unspoken, a way to honor courage, and a method to transform grief into something meaningful. The day of the performance arrived, and the audience was filled with anticipation. Families, soldiers, veterans, and civilians gathered to pay tribute to those who had sacrificed for their country. As James stepped onto the stage, he felt the familiar mix of nerves and determination. He placed the violin under his chin, closed his eyes, and began to play. The music filled the hall, carrying the stories of bravery, loyalty, and friendship. Tears glistened in the eyes of many, and a hush of reverence settled over the crowd. When the final note faded, the applause was overwhelming. James lowered his violin, feeling a profound sense of fulfillment. He had honored the fallen once again, sharing their story with those who would remember them for years to come. He realized that this was more than music, it was legacy. Through his dedication, courage, and heart, he had created a lasting tribute that would inspire and move others long after the performance ended. In the end, James Whittaker remained a royal guard, a disciplined protector of the crown, but he was also so much more. He was a musician, a storyteller, and a living tribute to those he had lost. His life became a testament to the power of memory, the courage to express emotion, and the enduring impact of honoring those who had shaped our lives. Through the violin, he had found a way to keep the past alive, transform grief into beauty, and inspire generations to come.